Arben Kodra was never arrested, never photographed, and never charged. But his revenge erased an entire Liverpool gang without starting a war. Please subscribe and share for daily new update of gang crime story and watch till end. Liverpool had always carried two faces. One belonged to football chants, waterfront museums, and families walking along the Mersey. The other lived quietly beneath the surface, hidden in closed warehouses, empty dock offices, and streets that cameras rarely watched. For decades, small local gangs ruled this underground world. Their power came from familiarity, not intelligence. They knew the streets, the people, and the police routines. They believed nothing outside Liverpool could ever truly control it. The docks were the city's true heartbeat. Containers arrived day and night, filled with legal goods that masked illegal cargo moving just as easily. Drugs, counterfeit products, and untaxed alcohol passed through without raising alarms. Most shipments were handled by trusted locals who had grown up together. Loyalty was based on history, not discipline. Mistakes were common, but they were forgiven as long as money kept flowing. Violence was used when needed, but rarely planned with care. Into this environment stepped Arben Kodra. He arrived in the UK quietly, without drama or background noise. He did not come with a crew or reputation. To immigration records, he was just another Eastern European worker seeking opportunity. To Liverpool's underworld, he barely existed. He rented a small flat, far from gang-controlled areas, and kept a low-paying public job. Nothing about his life suggested ambition. What no one saw was how closely Arben observed everything around him. He spent evenings walking near the docks, watching delivery schedules and security gaps. He visited cash-based businesses, noting how money moved without receipts. He listened more than he spoke. Over time, patterns formed in his mind. He understood that Liverpool's gangs were strong on the streets but weak in structure. There was no central control, no long-term planning, and no protection against outside influence. Arben was not interested in fast money. He believed control came from patience. Instead of drugs or weapons, he started with businesses. A small car wash opened under his name, then a storage unit company, then a takeaway shop that stayed open late, but rarely had customers. These places were not meant to succeed publicly. They were tools designed to move cash and hide activity. Every step looked legal on paper. Meanwhile, unknown to the local gangs, Albanian couriers began appearing in Liverpool. They were quiet, disciplined, and temporary. They did not stay long enough to be noticed. They followed strict rules and left no personal connections behind. Slowly, supply lines that once relied on unreliable locals shifted hands. The city did not feel the change at first. There was no violence, no sudden wealth, no warning signs. Liverpool's gang leaders believed the city was calm. They mistook silence for safety. They did not realize a new system was forming beneath them, one that did not depend on fear or reputation. By the time they noticed unfamiliar faces near their territory, it was already too late. The quiet port city was no longer just being watched. It was being claimed. Arben Kodra continued to move carefully, knowing that speed attracted attention and attention invited failure. His early businesses began to serve their real purpose. Cash moved in small amounts at first, mixed with legitimate income to avoid suspicion. Every transaction was recorded cleanly, leaving nothing that looked unusual to banks or tax offices. While local gangs still relied on hand-to-hand deals and trust built on fear, Arben built systems that removed emotion from crime. The docks remained his primary focus. Instead of challenging existing players, he worked around them. Albanian couriers collected packages already inside the city, avoiding the risky import stage. This method reduced exposure and blame. If something went wrong, the loss was small and easy to replace. The locals assumed these couriers were temporary runners hired by familiar gangs. No one questioned where they truly reported. At the same time, Arben began identifying weak links within Liverpool's criminal circles. Addicts who talked too much, enforcers with gambling debts, drivers facing family pressure. He never approached them directly. Others did that work for him, people who offered solutions instead of threats. Debts were paid quietly. Problems were solved quickly. Loyalty shifted without confrontation. What truly separated Arben's operation was discipline. His people followed instructions exactly. There were no personal side deals, no unnecessary violence, and no public displays of power. Mistakes were corrected without emotion. Anyone who could not follow rules was removed from the system before becoming a risk. This created stability, something Liverpool's street gangs had never mastered. Rumors began to circulate about cleaner supply and better profits. Street dealers noticed that certain products arrived consistently and in perfect condition. Prices stabilized, competition strangely reduced. Older gang leaders believed this was a sign of peace. They assumed rivals were stepping back. In reality, they were being slowly replaced. Arben avoided meetings with major figures. He did not attend parties or underground gatherings. Instead, he relied on intermediaries who never saw the full picture. Each person only knew their part. If one piece failed, the rest survived. This structure confused law enforcement as well. Investigators noticed changes in distribution, but could not find a central figure. Arrests led nowhere. Money laundering became the silent engine of growth. Profits were reinvested into property, transport, and logistics. Vans, warehouses, and delivery routes appeared legally owned but criminally used. The network expanded without attracting headlines. Violence stayed low, making police less aggressive. The city felt unusually calm for an active underworld. Liverpool's established gangs remained unaware of how much power they had already lost. Territory boundaries still existed on maps, but control had shifted to those managing supply and money. Arben's network did not need to claim streets. It owned the flow beneath them. By the time local leaders began noticing missing payments and unfamiliar instructions reaching their own crews, Arben had already secured something far more valuable than fear. He had control without conflict. The first hidden move was complete, and the city did not yet realize that its underworld was no longer local. The balance Arben Kodra had created did not break suddenly. It cracked slowly, in a way that felt accidental rather than deliberate. Liverpool's underworld had long survived on blurred rules and unspoken understandings. One of those rules was simple. Shipments that arrived quietly were left untouched. When that rule was ignored, it was never a misunderstanding. It was a challenge. Callum Rees had risen faster than most street leaders. He was younger, reckless, and hungry for recognition. His crew controlled a shrinking patch of territory, and profits were no longer matching his ambition. When one of Arben's shipments passed through a warehouse, Callum believed was still under local influence. Temptation outweighed caution. The load was diverted, split, and sold quickly. To Callum, it felt like reclaiming control. To Arben, it was a message sent without permission. What followed was not immediate retaliation, no sudden violence, no warning signs. Arben understood that quick revenge satisfied emotions but exposed systems. Instead, he treated the theft as a signal that weaknesses still existed. He paused expansion and shifted focus inward. The question was not who took the shipment. It was who allowed it to happen. Information became more valuable than punishment. Arben's network began mapping Callum's world in detail. Financial pressure points were identified first. Associates who relied on shared funds suddenly faced delays. Vehicles broke down at critical moments. Storage spaces were unexpectedly inspected by authorities after anonymous tips. Each incident looked isolated, like bad luck following bad decisions. Callum sensed resistance, but misunderstood its source. He believed rival local gangs were testing him. This pushed him to tighten control, creating fear within his own circle. That fear produced mistakes. People spoke carelessly. Movements became predictable. Arben's observers documented everything without stepping into view. The next phase targeted reputation. Quiet rumors spread that Callum could no longer protect his own supply lines. Dealers noticed inconsistent product quality. Payments arrived late. Trust weakened. In Liverpool's street economy, doubt was more damaging than violence. Allies began distancing themselves to avoid being dragged down. Only after the foundation was weakened did consequences become physical. Incidents occurred far from public view. Individuals connected to the stolen shipment were attacked in ways that left no witnesses and no clear motive. Each event seemed unrelated. Police reports failed to connect them. To the streets, it felt like a curse rather than an organized response. Callum tried to reassert dominance, but every move was anticipated. His routes were known. His habits were predictable. What he believed to be loyalty was already compromised. The more aggressively he acted, the more isolated he became. Arben never appeared, never threatened, and never claimed responsibility. Control was maintained through absence. The theft that had seemed like an easy win slowly revealed its true cost. Callum's gang began collapsing under pressure they could not identify. Income dried up, protection vanished. Fear replaced confidence. By the time Callum understood that the shipment had not belonged to a local rival, but to a far larger system, the damage was irreversible. The betrayal had changed everything, but not in the way anyone expected. There was no open war, no dramatic showdown. Instead, Liverpool's Underworld learned a new rule too late. Stealing from silence was more dangerous than stealing from power. The retaliation that followed did not arrive with explosions or public bloodshed. It unfolded quietly, almost invisibly, blending into the background of everyday crime. Arben Kodra understood that loud violence attracted attention, and attention was the only real enemy. The goal was not to punish quickly, but to erase threats without leaving fingerprints. What came next felt less like revenge and more like systematic removal. The first blows landed in places no one expected. Bank accounts linked to Callum Rees's associates were suddenly frozen after routine compliance checks. Vehicles used for transport were seized for paperwork violations. Warehouses failed surprise inspections and were closed indefinitely. Each action was legal on the surface, triggered by anonymous reports that looked legitimate. The system turned against Callum's network without ever revealing who pushed the first piece. As resources vanished, pressure grew inside the gang. Members began cutting corners to survive. Those shortcuts created exposure. Arrests followed, but not in clusters. One here, one there. Charges were minor, but frequent enough to drain money and morale. Legal fees piled up. Families demanded answers. Loyalty weakened under stress, and silence became harder to maintain. Only after the structure was fragile did violence reappear, but it was calculated and rare. Isolated figures tied directly to the stolen shipment were attacked in locations far from their usual routes. No weapons were ever recovered. No witnesses stepped forward. Each incident looked personal rather than organized. Police could not connect the dots, and the media struggled to frame a narrative. Fear spread faster than facts. People associated with Callum's crew began disappearing from meetings and routines. Some fled the city. Others stopped answering calls. Rumors suggested an unseen force was cleaning the streets. The idea of an invisible enemy was more terrifying than a known rival. Panic fractured what remained of the gang. Meanwhile, Arben's network expanded into the spaces left behind. Supply lines adjusted effortlessly. New faces filled roles without drawing attention. There was no announcement of victory. Control simply shifted. Dealers who once relied on Callum's protection found themselves answering to new intermediaries who offered stability instead of threats. Profits returned, but obedience replaced fear. Callum attempted to respond, but every move failed. Safe locations were no longer safe. Messages were intercepted. Plans collapsed before execution. The sense of being watched destroyed confidence. What remained of his authority existed only in memory. The street no longer recognized his name as protection. Law enforcement noticed a decline in open conflict and assumed tensions were easing. In reality, the war had already ended. Revenge had been delivered not through chaos, but through precision. Arben never broke cover. No public act tied him to the collapse. His strength remained invisible, which made it unstoppable. By the time the final remnants of Callum's crew dissolved, Liverpool's underworld had quietly realigned. The lesson was clear but unspoken. Power no longer belonged to those who ruled the streets loudly. It belonged to those who could destroy an enemy without ever being seen. With Callum Reese's network effectively dismantled, the streets did not erupt into chaos, as many expected. Instead, an unusual calm settled over Liverpool's underworld. The absence of open conflict created a vacuum, and vacuums never stayed empty for long. Arben Kodra's system moved into that space with quiet efficiency, not as an invading force, but as a replacement that felt almost natural. Younger criminals were the first to adapt. They had grown tired of unstable leadership and constant risk. Arben's operation offered something different: predictable income, clear rules, and minimal exposure. There were no loyalty speeches or violent initiations. Advancement came through reliability, not aggression. This approach appealed to those who saw crime as business rather than identity. Control of the docks became the network's strongest asset. Transport schedules were synchronized with legal shipping activity, allowing illegal goods to move unnoticed. Drivers followed precise routes and timelines. Any deviation was corrected immediately. Losses dropped, profits increased, and the system proved resilient even when individual parts failed. Liverpool's underworld had never seen this level of organization. As influence grew, Arben avoided public recognition. Others were allowed to appear powerful, absorbing attention and risk. These visible figures acted as buffers between the network and law enforcement. When arrests occurred, they led nowhere meaningful. Investigators faced disconnected pieces rather than a unified structure. The idea of a single controlling force remained unproven. Money management was what truly secured dominance. Profits were no longer spent recklessly. They were reinvested into logistics, property, and legitimate enterprises. Transport companies expanded. Warehouses changed ownership. Businesses linked to the network became community fixtures, further hiding criminal activity in plain sight. The line between legal and illegal blurred intentionally. Rival groups attempted to challenge the growing influence, but resistance faded quickly. Without access to supply, their power meant little. Street violence became pointless when products dried up overnight. Many rivals chose cooperation over confrontation. Others simply disappeared from relevance. No major battles were needed. Control was achieved through dependency. The public narrative suggested crime was declining. Fewer visible conflicts meant fewer headlines. Police resources shifted elsewhere. This worked perfectly for Arben's operation. Stability was the greatest shield. The more normal things appeared, the harder it was to justify deeper investigations. By this stage, Liverpool's criminal ecosystem had fundamentally changed. Street-level power no longer dictated authority. The real influence existed in spreadsheets, shipping manifests, and financial records that looked clean. Arben had transformed the underworld from chaotic violence into a silent machine. Yet beneath the success lay a hidden fragility. Growth brought ambition, and ambition invited greed. The system relied on absolute discipline. Any crack could spread quickly. Those closest to the operation sensed pressure building, even as profits peaked. The rise of the Albanian network appeared complete, but its greatest threat was no longer outside. It was already forming within. For a long time, Arben Kodra was seen as the architect of Liverpool's transformation, even if his name never appeared in official records. Those who worked close to the operation believed he controlled every decision, every route, and every outcome. This belief was carefully maintained. It protected the real structure by offering investigators and rivals a single figure to focus on. What remained hidden was that Arben was only part of a much deeper design. The true control lived in numbers rather than territory. Financial flows dictated power, and those flows were managed by Elira Dreshaj. She had arrived in the UK years earlier under a legitimate professional visa, building a quiet career in accounting and consultancy. Her public life was ordinary, unremarkable, and entirely legal. Behind that life, she constructed the system that allowed the network to survive without violence. Elira understood that modern organized crime did not collapse from arrests alone. It collapsed when money trails became visible. Her work ensured that profits dissolved into layers of transactions, property investments, and offshore accounts. Each movement followed legal standards closely enough to avoid suspicion. Audits revealed nothing unusual. Even when authorities suspected laundering, they could not prove intent. While Arben focused on logistics and control of supply, Elira shaped the revenge strategy that destroyed Callum Rees's crew. Financial pressure replaced brute force. Anonymous compliance reports, regulatory triggers, and administrative shutdowns were her tools. She weaponized the system designed to protect society, turning it against those who relied on chaos. The brilliance of Elira's approach was invisibility. She never interacted with street-level figures. She communicated through structures, not people. When individuals were arrested or removed, the system continued without disruption. This separation ensured resilience. No single failure could expose the whole. Arben accepted his role as the visible shadow. He allowed others to believe he was the mastermind because it reduced risk to the core. This was not weakness, but strategy. The network thrived on misdirection. Even loyal members did not know who truly controlled decisions. Authority felt distant and impersonal, which discouraged rebellion. However, secrecy created its own dangers. Those closest to power began competing for influence, unaware of where real authority lay. Miscalculations followed. A senior lieutenant attempted to access funds without approval, believing the system had no central guard. The attempt failed silently, flagged instantly by Elira's monitoring systems. Instead of public punishment, the response was surgical. Access vanished. Assets were frozen. The lieutenant's role was erased without explanation. Others noticed the disappearance and understood the warning. Control had limits, and those limits were enforced without emotion. The revelation of Elira's role was never public. Law enforcement continued chasing faces while the structure remained untouched. The twist was not that the network was intelligent, but that it was designed to survive attention. Liverpool's underworld had been reshaped not by a kingpin, but by a strategist who never needed to appear. Success created an illusion of permanence, and that illusion began to weaken the very discipline that had built the network. As profits increased and risks seemed lower, certain members grew impatient with the rules that once protected them. The system relied on obedience and silence, but greed has a way of making people believe they are smarter than the structure that supports them. The first cracks appeared quietly. Financial reports showed irregular timing in transfers that should have followed strict patterns. Small amounts went missing, not enough to trigger alarms immediately, but enough to suggest someone was testing boundaries. Elira Dreshaj noticed the discrepancies early. Patterns always revealed intention. Someone inside was probing for weakness. The culprit was a trusted operational coordinator who believed law enforcement pressure was fading. He assumed that selling partial information could secure protection without real consequences. He underestimated the system's ability to detect internal threats. The network had been built to defend against outsiders, but it was equally prepared to neutralize betrayal from within. Instead of confronting the traitor, Elira allowed the situation to develop just enough to identify connected risks. Communication channels were monitored, Financial access points were traced. The betrayal was not isolated. Others were considering similar moves. The danger was spreading silently. When the response came, it was immediate and total. Access to funds vanished overnight. Properties tied to compromised individuals were transferred or abandoned. Key figures lost contact with one another as communication lines went dead. No warnings were given. No explanations followed. It felt as though the network itself had evaporated. Panic followed confusion. Those involved in the betrayal realized too late that the system did not rely on any one person. Their value had always been temporary. With resources gone, they became exposed. Some fled the country. Others vanished into legal trouble, unable to afford protection or silence. None were publicly connected to the network, which ensured the core remained untouched. Law enforcement raids began shortly after. Locations once believed to be critical turned out to be empty shells. Documents had been destroyed. Digital trails ended abruptly. Investigators found evidence of crime, but no clear hierarchy. The operation appeared fragmented, almost amateur, despite years of dominance. From the outside, it looked like collapse. In reality, it was a controlled withdrawal. The network did not fight the exposure. It stepped away from visibility entirely. Routes were shut down. Businesses changed ownership. The flow of illegal goods slowed and then stopped. Liverpool's underworld entered a period of uncertainty. No single group filled the void immediately. Former rivals waited for signs of weakness that never appeared. The Albanian network had not been defeated. It had simply chosen to disappear. Those who understood the system recognized the truth. The rise had ended not with arrests or violence, but with discipline reclaiming control. The collapse from the inside was not a failure. It was an exit, executed with the same precision that had once built an empire. Success created an illusion of permanence, and that illusion slowly weakened the discipline that had once made the network untouchable. As profits grew and pressure from rivals faded, certain members began to believe the system needed them more than they needed the system. Rules that were once followed without question started to feel optional. Small risks were taken, and slightly bigger ones, each justified by past success. The first warning signs appeared in the finances. Transfers that had always followed exact patterns began arriving late or divided into unusual amounts. These were not mistakes. They were tests. Someone inside was trying to see how far they could move without being noticed. The sums were small, but the intent was dangerous. Elira Dreshaj recognized the shift immediately. She had designed the system to detect behavior, not just numbers. The source of the breach was a senior coordinator trusted with logistics and internal reporting. Years of loyalty had convinced him that exposure was unlikely. Police attention had declined, and the streets were quiet. He believed selling limited information could buy future safety without damaging the whole operation. What he did not understand was that the system treated betrayal as a structural threat, not a personal one. Elira did not react emotionally or publicly. Instead, she allowed the coordinator to continue just long enough to reveal the full scope of risk. Communication channels were quietly observed. Access logs were reviewed. It became clear that others were watching, considering similar moves. The danger was no longer a single individual, but a growing mindset. When action came, it arrived without warning. Financial access disappeared overnight. Accounts were locked, properties transferred, and digital credentials revoked. Key figures woke up cut off from money, contacts, and protection. There were no messages explaining why. Silence delivered the message more clearly than violence ever could. The sudden isolation triggered panic. Those involved tried to reach each other, only to realize the network they depended on no longer existed for them. Some attempted to run. Others were forced into desperate decisions that exposed them to law enforcement. Without resources, their value vanished instantly. Police raids followed soon after, guided by fragments of information that were already outdated. Locations once believed to be central hubs were empty. Records had been destroyed. The structure investigators expected to uncover simply was not there. What remained looked disorganized, misleading authorities into believing the operation had collapsed under pressure. In reality, the disappearance was deliberate. Routes were shut down by choice, not force. Businesses were sold or abandoned legally. The flow of illegal goods slowed and then stopped completely. The network did not fight exposure. It stepped away before it could be damaged. Liverpool's underworld entered a strange silence. Rivals waited for signs of weakness that never came. The Albanian network had not been defeated or dismantled. It had withdrawn on its own terms, proving that the most powerful exit is the one no one sees coming. When the silence finally settled, Liverpool appeared unchanged on the surface. The docks continued to operate, streets remained busy, and the rhythm of the city moved forward without pause. Yet beneath that normality, the criminal landscape had been permanently altered. The absence left by the Albanian network was not chaos, but hesitation. Everyone knew something powerful had passed through and vanished without being caught. Local gangs attempted to reclaim old territory, but the conditions that once supported them no longer existed. Supply chains were unstable, trust was fractured, and fear each direction. No one knew who was still watching or whether the system could return at any moment. That uncertainty became its own form of control. Law enforcement reviewed years of operations, convinced they had missed a critical opportunity. Reports described a rise and sudden disappearance of a highly organized network, but no clear leadership, no final arrests, and no definitive victory. Files remained open, labeled unresolved. The case became a lesson in how modern organized crime avoided confrontation and survived through adaptability. Arben Kodra left the UK quietly, using legal documentation and unremarkable travel records. There were no warrants and no charges linking him to anything more than failed businesses. His name faded from intelligence briefings, replaced by new priorities. To authorities, he was a possibility that could never be proven. Elira Dreshaj remained even further out of reach. Her professional career continued uninterrupted. Financial records showed nothing criminal. The structure she built dissolved back into legitimate systems. Without evidence, there was no reason to look deeper. The strategist behind the rise and retreat was never acknowledged publicly. For those who had lived inside the network, the ending felt unfinished. There was no victory parade, no final reckoning, and no closure. Only a quiet understanding that the rules of power had changed. Violence was no longer the measure of dominance. Control had shifted to those who could build, erase, and rebuild without leaving marks. Liverpool's underworld adjusted slowly. Smaller groups became cautious. Operations shrank. Risk was avoided rather than embraced. The memory of the Albanian network's rise lingered like a warning, not because of brutality, but because of how little resistance it had faced. Years later, the story remained fragmented, shared in pieces by those who had witnessed it from the edges. It was never confirmed, never fully denied. The war had not ended with arrests or bloodshed, but with disappearance. In Liverpool, the streets learned the quiet truth. The most dangerous forces are not the ones that fight loudly, but the ones that leave without a trace.